Yep, back. Yes, we're doing more live streaming and we're going to talk about high-level characters today. To be honest, this video is more for players than Dungeon Masters, but I feel like the message for today will be helpful to Dungeon Masters, although I am trying to put this together more in terms of how a player might be thinking in terms of the game. So for those of you who were expecting me to talk about how to manage high-level characters in Dungeons & Dragons, I've already done that. I'm actually going to talk very much about what playing a high-level character is like. Okay, that is my focus. And I'm leaving the really important information to the very last. Okay, alright, so I'm going to pull up my face. You'll find that I put the start time for this video down in the description once YouTube publishes it and I get a chance to sort of see what the time frame is. You will find that my videos go unlisted, so you can't access them unless you have subscribed to my channel, hit the bell button, and also made sure to turn on notifications. Now, normally, if you haven't ever been part of my live streams before, I will present everything first, and then once I've presented everything first, I then open it up for questions and answers. I'm going to, obviously, you're going to get to see my face at the very beginning and during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. Okay, now for those of you who are patrons, this will go up on the patron page, the live stream. The edited version will come out a couple of days later when I get a chance to sort of finally do all that processing and so forth. Okay. Right, let's get rid of the earplugs because I don't need them. Let's ditch them. Let's talk very much about high-level play. And this might give some Dungeon Masters an idea of what it's like, but I am going to talk about what it was like for players and for me playing high-level games. And this is from my personal experience. So yes, I'm going to share some stories. Hi, welcome to HowtoDandD. My name is Fred Wheeler and today I want to talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5e. Oh my gosh, don't I always talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5e? Well, today's topic is high-level characters in Dungeons & Dragons 5e. Now, for anybody who's played previous versions of Dungeons & Dragons, they will know that high-level play is very exciting. For players, you get access to so many incredible aspects, spells, abilities, powers, whatever you want to call them. So it's very exciting. And I can totally understand your view behind that because playing at a high level with a character sounds like a lot of fun. So what I thought I would do for today to make a sort of a change from what I tend to do is rather than talk about things from the perspective that you've usually heard before, I would actually talk from the perspective of, do you really want to know what it's like to play a high-level character and play, say, a level 20 PC or player character? Would you like to know what tends to happen? And the sort of things you as a player might want to implement or be ready to expect. And that is really the focus for today. There will be a few things that are useful for Dungeon Masters as I go through this, but really I am talking primarily about things that will be useful for you as a player so you understand what's likely to take place when you're playing the game. And at the very end of the presentation, I'm going to sort of drop my big bombshells, you might say, to give you a really good idea of what's going on in terms of your high-level games and your high-level characters. So the very first thing you'll tend to find is this is your opportunity to roll like a bucket load of dice for damage. And not just damage. If you're playing a fighter, it's quite possible to have anywhere from 4 to 5 attacks in one turn. So that's 4 or 5 d20s to roll, plus all the damage dice. And if you're playing a fighter and you use Action Surge, you can have up to 10 attacks taking place at high level. Now that sounds like a wonderful thing to have, and I totally get it. But what a lot of my players would do is they would go out and they would buy like 4 or 5 different sets of dice to contend with this, because you just can't roll them one at a time. You've got to roll them all at the same time. Otherwise, you're going to be there a long time. Even they will get frustrated. So a lot of my players would literally have little, I wouldn't say a bucket, but like a mug and separate dice, and they would all be laid out in front of them, ready to go. So when their turn came through, and it was, right, it's your turn, Bob, Jill, whoever it was, they would just grab the dice, they're ready to go, and they'd roll the whole lot into, often they would have a dice tray. I found that a lot of high-level characters, the players would bring along dice trays, and these are often portable, things that you can sort of fold up and then fold away, or fold out when you need to use them. Really clever idea. And they usually had like a lot of dice, because they were going to be rolling a lot of dice, not just for attacks, but also for damage. And even with your spellcasters, a lot of your spells, something like Fireball or Lightning Bolt, and even some of the other spells, you're rolling like 8 6-sided dice, and if you cast it at a higher level, you're rolling even more dice. So the number of dice you roll is certainly increased. It's your opportunity to cause stupid amounts of damage. I can't count the number of times that players would roll their damage dice. Now I'm talking about your paladins, your rogue. There are other characters. Quite often I would find that the players had multi-classed, and so they were dipping into different classes. When you have something like a paladin mixed with a rogue, it is a frightening concept, and if you can do it well, great for you. But yes, in excess of 100 hit points worth of damage with a single blow or during a single turn. These are the sorts of things are possible at high level. And if you're looking forward to that, make sure you bring enough dice along to deal with something like that. Because often the fact that you're doing so much dice is not a result of tacking on Great Weapon Master and bumping up your static damage modifier. It's because you're just rolling so many dice all at once. And this will tend to happen when you start rolling criticals. But it can also happen or get very close to the 100 factor even when you don't roll a critical. So pretty exciting stuff, yes. Okay, so what about, essentially you're going to be playing an invincible superhero. And I think this is what a lot of players really like. The idea that, because at low level, your character does feel like it can get knocked down. You're not necessarily going to get killed outright at level 1 or 2, or even level 3 with Dungeons & Dragons 5e, but certainly the chance of you going down or being killed outright is almost impossible to achieve. There's really nothing that a Dungeon Master has in terms of damage output that can outright instantly kill a high-level character. So you are essentially invincible, unless you're in the wrong type of environment. So if you're like on the fire plane, or if you're underwater, things like that, that can cause problems because of ongoing damage when you're unconscious, if you wind up falling unconscious, which is very easy to do if you are already drowning and have gone all the way down to 0 hit points, and you're now suffocating essentially because you can't hold your breath anymore. So those sort of things can come up, and my advice to you is you don't necessarily need to concern yourself quite so much with spells and even magic potions and so forth that will increase your hit points. Because even when you drop to like 0 hit points, the chances are there really isn't enough damage output coming through to instantly kill your character anyway. It can happen occasionally, but it's very rare. You're going to get to cast spells that change the very nature of reality and time. And my players, when they were playing the game, they would use spells like Wish, and a lot of the divine spells, divination spells, and change the very nature and fabric of their world. Polymorph is a good example. You're really changing the nature of reality with something like polymorph, true polymorph. So when you start making bad decisions and you're worried about the consequences of those, it's actually possible at high level to actually change the outcome. So if the outcome was failure and you didn't succeed at your quest for whatever reason, you can actually use spells to change that outcome. By my players would often travel in time. On one occasion, they made such a mess of the campaign, they used the wish spell and went back in time to repair the damage they had done initially. They got really greedy, and I think somebody decided that they should try and find out what actually happens if you stick multiple bags of holding inside each other and see what happens. Well, bad things will happen, because that's what that the world came to an end, essentially. They had like 14 bags of holding. They decided to stick all of them together at the same time, and I think it was 2 or 3 of them who did that. So some pretty crazy stuff. Your character's turn is going to take about 5 times as long. When you were playing at low level, you had your turn, so forth. Even if you're very experienced, just because of the sheer amount of mathematics involved, the number of dice you're rolling, the types of spells and class features, the number of attacks you have, you're going to take about 5 times as long, unless you're really, really onto it. But I found that about 5 times as long is about right. Now, this is awesome stuff. The only problem is that other people at the table are going to get to have a turn, and they're going to be taking probably just as long, if not longer. So yes, you're going to get a much longer turn in terms of combat. Only you can make the old gods look like a bunch of sissies. This is the point where you start battling gods, not some sort of villain or monster or creature. I mean, most of the monsters and creatures in the Monster Manual for Dungeons & Dragons 5e, at a certain point, you can deal with pretty much all of them. Unless, of course, you have a Dungeon Master who's very, very cunning and clever, and they have used really good tactics, set up their environment just right, and they have also utilised things like minions or other effects. Maybe they've incorporated a trap or a timer of some kind, so you have to also achieve a particular goal, whether that's flip a lever or something like that. But essentially, your character's moving into godhood. That means that you're going to have to make space, right? Essentially, at some point when your character retires, you're probably going to wind up being classified as one of the gods, or at least a demigod of some kind. And of course, if you've got a dungeon master who doesn't feel that your character's like godlike, because they certainly will seem like it later on, then you are definitely right up there in the legendary section of heroes, a legendary hero at high level play. Okay, so when it comes to really sort of mixing things up, there's nothing the Dungeon Master can throw at you that has a chance anymore. I found that without a Dungeon Master making serious modifications to the game, there's really nothing much in terms of combat that can surprise you. The only thing they can really do at high level is present you with exploration and social interactions. Social interactions are the Achilles heel for high level play, because they're very much based on what you as a player say and do. It's not going to just be down to a dice roll in most cases, unless you have a dungeon master who's quite happy to just determine all social interactions by a single dice roll or a series of dice rolls, and you've got a really high modifier or something like that. But often that's not the case. A lot of the NPCs, villains, will have ulterior motives, and you'll have to figure out what their motive is. And you might find that no matter how you approach an NPC, the outcome is always bad for you, so you really can't necessarily trust anything that they say, particularly if you know they are the villain. So trickery, deception, they tend to be more difficult compared to something like combat, because as you'll notice, when you look at your character and the character progression, most of the things you get as you level up are very much focused on combat rather than anything else. So that means that you wind up becoming very strong at combat but weaker at the other aspects, and the other aspects of the game are more tied to how you play the game rather than the mechanical aspects of your character. So those are the things that a dungeon master will tend to start relying on, because they really can't test you with combat anymore, because there's nothing they can really throw at you. Things like divination spells can be used to predict the future, spy on enemies, and you'll find that you'll have to be very careful when you're using those spells. They come off no problem the first time round. And then your dungeon master will start to get a little bit more cunning and coy and read the spell a bit more and start to change the aspect. They might be more cryptic. I know that as a dungeon master myself, I was more cryptic. I watched other dungeon masters provide rather cryptic descriptions of what might take place when divination spells were used. And then, of course, divination spells can be used against you. So once you start using them, your dungeon master will probably start pulling them out as well and having your villains used something like scry and spying on you, or predicting events and so forth. And I mean, you can look at that as, oh well, that's countering what I'm doing and that's metagaming, and it might well be to a certain degree, but often too you're just dealing with enemies and villains that are close to or just as powerful or more powerful than you are, and they're using those spells in that way for a very good reason. One of the things that really untangles a game, and you're going to get access to greater invisibility if you're a spellcaster and it's on your spellcasting list. Greater invisibility gives you an amazing advantage when it comes to making attacks. It doesn't give away your position in terms of making you visible. You don't become visible. They'll know where the attack came from, but then of course you do the normal, I'm going to make my attack while I've got greater invisibility on me. I'm going to move, okay, and I'm still invisible, so now they have to rely on other aspects of perception, such as listening to you, so hearing, or something like scent, if your dungeon master's using scent, smells, stuff like that. Maybe it might even be, they're dealing with a monster that doesn't rely on vision to actually detect you, so they're dealing with creatures that use tremor sense or true sight or blind sight, so that sort of changes things again. But greater invisibility, I know, is hugely useful. When you get it, use it, because I found it very, very useful myself. It will frustrate and confuse the dungeon master, and it makes it really difficult for a dungeon master to track as well, particularly if there's multiple players in your group who are all using greater invisibility at the same time. This doesn't happen very often unless people have multi-classed, but it can happen. I know recently in my own game, we had 3 people who were invisible out of 4. One was not invisible, and they wound up getting attacked the most. 2 of us had greater invisibility, a bard and a sorcerer, and then we also had a cleric who had a particular feature that didn't give them greater invisibility, but just standard invisibility. And that changes everything. Then your dungeon master brings in their monsters, and they're also got greater invisibility or invisibility. And so tracking all of that can get very confusing at times. So just bear in mind when you start pulling this out that when you start using invisibility in your game, you do extend the amount of time it takes to actually figure out all that sort of stuff in your game. And that's just a product of, who can see whom, and trying to determine the best way of positioning people without people deliberately metagaming. That tends to happen. Okay, I want to talk about evasion. I'm talking about the rogue and the monk. It makes it possible, literally, to dodge 9 red dragons' fire breath for many rounds. This actually happened in one of my games. I had a player who was playing a high level monk. He's about level 14, 15, and he said to me, right in the middle of this big epic battle between the Cult of the Dragon, their army, and we're also dealing with sort of the Sword Coast Alliance, and he said, I know there's dragons in the field. I am going to walk out into no man's land and challenge them all by my lonesome. He spent 3 rounds as I had 9 red dragons breathe on him, and evasion saved him from taking absolutely no damage whatsoever. Now, I'm sure that that's not always going to be the case when you're playing the game, but it is possible. And in fact, when that character did finally go down, it was not the dragon breath. Normally I would recommend using the dragon breath. It was not the dragon breath that took down the monk. Those 9 dragons, and I believe they were adult red dragons, Essentially, he was just too hard to deal with. I used the bite and the claws. I could not lift him off the ground and drop him because you can only do a maximum of 20d6 worth of damage. You can only take them up to about 200 feet, and going any higher, they reach terminal velocity. So unless the Dungeon Master starts house ruling things, you can only do so much damage. And of course, with a monk, they have this special feature that means they can take less damage when they fall. And he was playing like level 14 or 15, I think it was roughly around there. So I'd already figured out, and he hadn't multi-classed at all, he'd already figured out that I couldn't pick him up and drop him and kill him that way. So essentially, yes, he was able to survive Dragon Breath without too much trouble. And 9 adult red dragons is like crazy stuff, right? But some fun and humorous things that can take place. Okay, this is where your attack modifiers will often get so high that you can only miss when you roll a 20-sided dice if you roll a 2 and a 1. I've seen this happen quite often. Where even with like a usually armor class sits in the range of about 14 through to 18, but it's possible if the players sort of maximize their ability score and of course their modifier plus proficiency on top of that, and if they have magic items as well that allow them a bonus to their attack as well, you're starting to look at situations where they can't miss unless that 20-sided dice rolls up a 2 or a 1, which is just crazy stuff, but it does happen, which means the likelihood is that you'll always hit. Then there's the combinations of feats. Feats are one of those things in the game that are really powerful, and I know a lot of people who will not worry about bumping up their ability score and therefore their modifier, and instead they rely on feats such as the Polearm Master, Sentinel, Lucky. There are a lot of other, and it's not just those feats, it's the combination of them, and there's lots of different combinations, so I don't want to talk about all of them. I just wanted to talk about one in particular that I've seen used many times, and Polearm Master, Sentinel, and Lucky are often the ones that I see at the table the most. But if you use your head and you think about how they fit together, there are a lot of different combinations that can make things quite interesting in terms of the outcome of the game. It allows you to change the probability of your game significantly by playing around with feats. You're going to be able to open doors to other worlds with just a spell. The gate spell, I remember, even though I didn't necessarily at times have my adventure running from one world to another, players could decide, well, no, I want to travel from here to another world, and I'm going to use the gate spell to do that. And so that means the Dungeon Master, you are able to actually force the game in a direction that the Dungeon Master may not be prepared for. So you might need to give them a little bit of leeway when you start doing this, because now it's like the world is your oyster. The universe is your oyster. You can go anywhere. And the gate spell is a really good example of that. And we're really looking at about, I wouldn't say it's epic level. You don't have to get to level 20 to get access to gate, but it'd be close to. Okay, and another one that crops up, and I think I briefly talked about it already, and that is being able to change or stop the flow of time itself. So whether you use something like Wish to travel back in time or change time in some way, there's also a spell called Time Stop, which essentially is more useful in combat and doesn't last a particularly long time, but it does allow you to do quite a lot, particularly if things get awkward. So if you need to escape, which you probably won't need to, but if you're dealing with a big bad and you want to deal with them quickly, Time Stop can change the aspect of your combat significantly. And I've heard of people using Time Stop out of sight of combat to do other things with the Dungeon Master's sort of veto, whether they decided that was appropriate for that situation. So be creative. There are ways of making it happen. You are now probably going to find that there are things such as meteorite swarms. So there's a meteorite swarm spell. So you can create a meteorite swarm. And essentially this is a huge area, multiple areas actually, and they're going to cause like 20d6 worth of damage. But here's the real amusing aspect, because I used to use this spell against the players' characters quite often, particularly at high level, because I ran from level 1 right through to level 20. And it is possible for almost all characters of any class at a high enough level to survive a meteorite swarm. You position it, you don't usually position them on top of each other. That's sort of a bit weird. You're supposed to sort of scatter them around. But it is possible for characters to still be standing after you drop one of these things. That's 20d6 worth of damage. High level characters can have anywhere from 200 to 250 hit points. Even a wizard is looking at the high numbers. They might go down, but often they still won't be killed outright. As I said, high level play, it's very hard to actually be instantly killed. So yes, you are going to be it's going to be possible to survive one of those spells. Okay, this is where magic items might very well be dripping from your limbs and body. And what you'll notice as you're playing the game is if you took all those magic items off, you'd still be perfectly fine, and you don't really need them. They're nice, but in a pinch, you can do without them, just because your character is so powerful. And I remember players mentioning to me on many occasions how it was like, I wanted this cool magic item, but I'm already so powerful. I don't really need that magic item. I could survive without that. I can achieve the goal without even using that. I've got spells and class features that are, better than my magic items in some aspects, and that's actually quite interesting. That means that if you have a dungeon master who doesn't like to give out a lot of magic items, you don't really have to worry about that, because you will find that your character is quite capable of managing without them. Okay, so all of this sounds absolutely great as a player, doesn't it? It sounds pretty cool, and it's really exciting, and it's exciting to think about working towards level 20. But here's the thing I want to just point out to you, and it's a sad fact, but it's true, and that is, unfortunately, it makes the dungeon master's task or job very hard, and they will tend to avoid high level play or campaigns or adventures. And generally the reason behind that is combat is the biggest issue for them. They just can't figure out how to make combat interesting and exciting without it becoming like a 2 or 3 hour dice rolling exercise where all of the sort of storytelling elements just don't feel quite the same. And I'm sure there are ways of making a long combat more exciting by using descriptions and narration and so forth, but nobody really signed up to really play one single combat for an hour or 2 hours or even 3 hours. And this is the sort of thing that can happen at high level. So if you don't mind that sort of thing, great. But the problem is you'll find a lot of dungeon masters just can't stand it. There's so much for them to track and manage that they will just despise the whole idea of trying to run a high level game. So I want you to be understanding to your dungeon master who is trying to avoid running high level adventures, because that's often why they will do that. And there's another aspect to that as well, and you might not be aware of it, but when it comes to high level play, a lot of the advice that dungeon masters will get is to run less combat. Essentially, run less combat, make your life easier, and do things like focus on exploration, set the players' characters a goal they have to achieve that's not combat focused. It might be the social aspects of the game. Negotiation often comes up as a big part of the game as well. So those things tend to become more important. And of course, all of your character advancement, almost all of it, has been focused on just getting more powerful in combat. and therefore suddenly you get higher in level, and yet you don't get to actually engage in high level battles and combat. And that's sort of really weird, right? It doesn't make an awful lot of sense, because you're dealing with a dungeon master who doesn't really see the point, because you've got access to raise dead, reincarnate, revivify, healing word. All of these things make it very difficult for your character to die. You can also get, later on, you're going to get true resurrection. So it doesn't even matter if you don't have the entire body, if it's not complete, you know. Reincarnate, we used to use reincarnate to bring a character back when we only had a part of them left, and we didn't have the entire body because, you know, the heart was torn out or the head came off or something like that. So this is one of those things where it's really weird that your progression as a character is very much combat focused, and yet your dungeon master is more than likely going to be focusing on something other than combat. And I know that's a hard thing to understand. So this is often why when you're playing with a dungeon master and they say, look, I'm only going to run games from level 1 to level 10 or level 1 to 15. I'm not going past that. I don't really want to go up into I don't want to go to level 20. It's just too hard. I totally understand that. It makes a lot of sense for them, even if it doesn't make a lot of sense to you as a player. I know that my players at my table who were playing from level 15 to 20 had a ball. They loved it. But it's still difficult to do. That's the only hassle. So I'm hoping you found this video helpful, informative, or useful in some way, and if you did, fantastic. I actually have hundreds of videos for players and dungeon masters giving you advice on various aspects of the Dungeons & Dragons game, mostly around Dungeons & Dragons 5e, but I have a guide on how to use adventuring gear, basic tactics, how to use some of the different class features, the basic core mechanics, things like that. And you're welcome to go and check that out. And there's a whole lot of other advice for dungeon masters on pretty much every aspect of the game at this point. Now, if you want to support my channel so I keep doing videos like this, I have a Patreon page where you get access to the unlisted live streams, additional content which I put out from time to time, and also you get priority on the videos that I make. And that's really helpful, particularly if you can't find what you're looking for on YouTube. I also have affiliate links to the book depository and Amazon where you can buy stuff online. I get a small commission. I have a merchandise shelf underneath all of my videos if you want some swag. Make sure to share, like, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to be notified when I go live and when I publish new videos. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s. Okay, I'm not gone. I'm just going to pull up my face and let's have a chat. Let's have a little chat about playing high-level characters. Now, whether you're a player or a dungeon master, it doesn't matter. I'm quite happy to talk about high-level play. What's it like? What your experience was like? So yes, I think this is a topic that when I was looking on YouTube and the internet, most of it seems to be around the dungeon master and explaining to the dungeon master how to manage high level play rather than what it's like to actually do it yourself as a player, and to get an idea of what your dungeon master might be going through and some of the sort of contradictory elements. You know, you got a character who's progressing in combat, and yet at high level your dungeon master will be steering away from combat more and more and more just because it's so difficult for them to manage. All right, are my eyes better today or worse? Oh, I think we're about there. Okay, prepared to cook and survive. How's it going? Sector Black's here. Oscar, hi Oscar. I will try basic D&D by the site. I think it's more simple. And 5th Ed edition PCs are like Power Rangers at high levels. Yes, they are. Very much so. I mean, literally, you know, I've seen monks dropped from high positions, and I think one day there was 72 points of damage done from 20 d6, and they took 2 damage just because of how it's figured out for the monk in terms of their Is it slow fall feature? I think it's called a slow fall feature. It's been a little while since I've had a look at that rule. But yes, their falling feature that allows them to take less damage. It was crazy, and they were making jokes about I'm doing my my superhero landing, and literally it did seem like they were doing a superhero landing. Not that it's no fun, is more difficult to figure the encounter challenge. Yeah, because you can't. You simply can't. You know, the mathematics. This is why a lot of dungeon masters give up, because mathematically it's impossible to figure out. There are too many aspects. You know, when you're a player and you've got all these options available to you, and then you've got a whole bunch of other people who have got all these options as well, when you put them together, there's no way of knowing how they're going to function together. There's too many synergies. It's almost as if, you know, you've been built to work together as a team, which of course you have. So no amount of calculations or mathematics can ever figure that out. Sabrina, hi, how's it going? Fellow dungeon delvers, yes, we are all dungeon delvers in some way. Hi, Carlos. Hi, Fred. Why not just throw more PC-style enemies at high levels to challenge high-level players, or reskin as monsters? See, here's the thing. What you got to understand is this is one aspect to that, Carlos. That, you know, as a player, you would think, well, why is your dungeon master not just creating a player character? Player characters are very, very complicated in comparison to a monster. So just imagine playing a whole bunch of different player character builds as a dungeon master in a high level game. It's like I said, it's going to take about 5 times longer for you to have your turn as a player, and your dungeon master is going to have what, 2, 3 different types of their own, maybe even 4, all, you know, just if we want to mirror the party themselves. That's the problem. So it doesn't change the issues that are there. So using a player character build or style for your monster as a dungeon master doesn't solve the problem of high level play for dungeon masters, which is why they will still avoid it if they can, and why a lot of dungeon masters will never touch it. So yeah, this is why I wanted to have a conversation near the end of the video and say, look, when they start presenting challenges and things that are less focused on combat, start retooling your character. Ask your dungeon master, I want to retool it, because really it's built for combat, but we're not really doing a lot of combat, we're doing other things. I think you'll find that most dungeon masters are fine with that. I know that I let my players do that all the time. I allow them to retrain or rebuild the character apart from their gear and gold and their name, their character name. Everything else they can adjust if they really want to. Just because, you know, once you make a decision, you're kind of locked in. Who knows how long you're going to be playing before you get to play a different character, which is why I always allowed my players to retrain their characters if they needed to. Now, I hope I get this name right. Ethel, hi there, how's it going? Just caught the tail end of your stream. Oh, I'm glad you were able to make it. Irene, hi Fred, what do you think of high-level players facing high-level NPCs? I mean, I've just sort of said it, that high-level NPCs that are built more like a monster are fine. But if they are built more like and have the same complexity as a player character, that I just talked about how difficult that is to do. It's actually really, really difficult to do. That's why your dungeon masters don't generally like doing it. There'll be a few out there who will include maybe 1 or 2 of them. There'll be a really brave soul who will try to run 4 of them all at the same time, but it'll make combat a dog, which is why if you watch one of my videos called high and epic level, managing high and epic level campaigns or adventures, that was more designed for dungeon masters. It talks more about avoiding running more combat and running other stuff, and you'll find a lot of the advice they, like I said, on YouTube they get and the internet is to not run quite so much combat and to do other things. So try to remember to build your character at high level to be really broad in its nature. A good example of high level play is now there's Horde of the Dragon Queen, which I can't stand. It goes from like level 1 to level 8. And then you've got supposedly from level 8 through to level 15, which doesn't make any sense, but we won't go there, is the Rise of Tiamat. And you're facing the Queen of Dragons, right? That's the whole premise of that. So everybody is trying to trick out their character to deal with that final battle with the Queen of Dragons and the Tyranny of Dragons. You know, when that first came out, that's what really people were focused on. But what is really amusing about the Rise of Tiamat, that second book in that story, is a lot of the challenges are not combat. They are, as I said, they are social interactions. There's a lot of negotiation. There's a lot of exploration. And my players, when they were playing through that particular adventure, found themselves in a pickle because they weren't built to deal with that. Because all of their character options they were getting were all combat focused, and they actually needed something else. What they needed was something that would help them sort of make their character a bit more robust when it came to dealing with other aspects of the game. But they didn't have them. And actually, you're kind of locked in at high level. You're kind of locked in with in terms of your options. As you progress in terms of your character, and short of, I know people are going to say, well, you can multi-class, you know, at higher levels rather than taking more levels in something. But really, multi-classing near the end of your character's development at higher level doesn't often make a lot of sense. And if you've ever played at high level, you'll understand what I mean. There's a lot of it's good to do it at the beginning, but to do it at the tail end can cause a whole lot of hassles. So that means you actually have less options as your character gets higher and higher in level. And I know people will say, no, if I'm a wizard, I mean, I can pick pretty much any spell I like. And yes, if you're a wizard, you've got a lot of versatility. If you're playing something like a fighter who is using the Battle Master features, yes, there's a lot of options there, so you've got a lot of flexibility. But again, it's really only the wizard who has that broad aspect, that they've got access to spells that are combat focused and utility. And it's those utility aspects to the game that are going to be more important at high level to deal with whatever your dungeon master is throwing at you. One of my advice, one of the pieces of advice I have for people who are playing Dungeons and Dragons at high level is go for the utility rituals. If you have a ritual caster, then go for the ritual spells that are utility focused. Even the low level ones can sometimes be hugely useful. It's amazing how useful something like the knock spell is when you start dealing with locks that can't really be picked easily with something like thieves' tools. And there will be locks that you come across that are like that, whereas the knock spell is a much better option. But yes, the utility. Now, if you're a spellcaster and you have the opportunity to become a ritual caster by picking up the feat, often that's a really good thing to do. I found that quite an amazing extra bonus. Now, if you are the kind of caster like a warlock who has a very, very small bracket of spells you can use and get access to, then it's a little bit more tricky and a little bit more complicated. But still, utility spells and ritual casting, really useful at high level. That way you can keep those spells for something else, those spell slots for something else later on. What do you got here? Should I worry about PCs becoming too OP at the higher levels? Okay, so here's the thing, too hard to challenge them. Look, you'll find that there's a big jump in your character power from level 5. As soon as you hit level 5, things change significantly in terms of a player's character. When you get to, I would say, once you get access to something like greater invisibility, once that spell opens up for the player's characters, really the game completely changes. I would find that many of my characters were using greater invisibility, or pass without a trace. and they could just sort of make their way to a location past an enemy or deal with them without too much effort. They didn't need to worry about having to fly and be invisible at the same time, which was often sort of the go-to in older versions of the game, such as 3.5, where you had crazy combinations where people were, invisible or had greater invisibility and were also flying at the same time. It does happen too. Remember, there are a couple of races that can fly. There are magic items that allow you to fly as well, so if you wind up with them, then you can, of course, stack them with something like greater invisibility. It makes a big difference when suddenly everybody, if they can't see you and they don't have the right type of perception to be able to detect you and get past the fact that they can't see you, then they have disadvantage on any attack against you. And they still got to figure out roughly where you are. Now, vision is always one of those things that makes it pretty easy to figure out where you are in terms of attacking somebody. Sound is a bit more difficult. If you've ever heard a sound, and this comes down to your Dungeon Master and how they run invisibility anyway. When it comes to sound, the location of where that sound came from is a bit more broad. It might not be broken down to a 5-foot square, So yes, it is going to be harder to challenge players at higher level because they are more powerful. And so therefore, this is why the game, a lot of people still try to run the game, or Dungeon Masters will run the game the same way they did when they were running a game for level 1 to 5 and then 5 to 10. Whereas actually it changes as you progress. So you have to be able to adjust that. And as I've already said, the players' characters, all of their progression for their character, almost all of it, is focused on combat. So that is the thing they will always be the strongest and best at. And they're certainly going to probably be better at it than monsters, unless you make and build your own monsters. And that requires a bit of practice. You'd be surprised. There are so many different aspects that, if you have 4 or 5 people at the table, one of the things I always found quite interesting is I was talking to Magic players who play the card game, and they use synergies. They will stack different things on top of each other. Well, that's essentially what's happening when you're dealing with Dungeons and Dragons. But now you don't just get to stack things like a spell effect. You can stack some of these class features as well, or even a racial feature, because they last more than one turn. They might last like a round until the end of your next round, or they might last for a minute. There's a lot of things that tend to last for quite a decent amount of time. And all you need is half a minute in terms of combat to get the job done. It still might take you 2 hours to run through the combat, but the number of rounds that passes, particularly at high level, may only be 5. I know as a Dungeon Master, my players made the mistake of saying to me one day, nothing you throw out at us is very difficult, Fred. And so I built a monster. And I built the monster to do enough damage to pretty much take most of their hit points down in one turn. And I gave it legendary actions. So at the end of every single person's turn, it got a legendary action. And this thing could do a lot of damage. It had ranged attacks, it had melee attacks. It was like a titanic god. It was massive, and it scared the bejesus out of them. But that was nothing. You would never find a stat block like that in any of the monster manuals that are produced for Dungeons and Dragons 5e. There's nothing in any of the books for any of the supplements or adventures, anything like that particular giant god that I made. So there's nothing out there that is pre-published that is powerful enough really to sort of do that kind of damage. And I mean, you could say, well, things like Queen of Dragons, Tiamat, and some of the demon gods, they're pretty powerful and so forth. Yeah, they're pretty powerful, but if you're dealing with anybody who's sort of beyond level 15 and into the up to 20, level 16 to 20, mate, they're still going to do pretty well. They're going to be able to deal with it. Okay, I just need a drink of water. Okay, Could higher level characters be cursed? Yes, they can always be cursed, but either by an item or by a spell in order to make things more interesting for them. Okay, so that feels like a totally different video, but you'll find that remove curse is actually quite a low level spell. So therefore, to remove the curse from them is going to be really easy. You know, it might be a hassle for 1 or 2 encounters till they can get the cleric to cast remove curse or find somebody to remove curse or get themselves a scroll. They're probably going to have more than enough money. So something like remove curse is only a temporary setback. So one of the things that I did in my own game is, players like magic items. And so they had to sort of weigh up, sometimes they would weigh up the difference between, is it worth having this magic item? It's cursed, but it does this. So, so you have to, if you're going to create magic items that have a curse on them, then you really need to think really hard about how do you make the item cursed, but they still want to keep it rather than just cast remove curse on it, because that's what will tend to happen. As I said, there's really nothing that you as a dungeon master can do to your players' characters when it comes to combat. The only Achilles heel that they will have are the things they haven't been getting as they've been leveling up, which is assistance with exploration and doing that more effectively. Things like achieving goals, because that requires not the character but their player brain to figure out. Social interactions, puzzles, something like that. Those are the things that are going to be more difficult for them to manage. That's my view anyway, and that's generally been my experience. Are there any more questions? Because I am very much ready to lose my voice and go. But yeah, I encourage you, if you are playing a high level game and you are a player playing a character, that if the dungeon master says, look, I don't want to keep playing this because it's a drag, then ask them, look, can we start retooling our character so it's a bit more broad in its look, so we can do more things, and instead of focusing so much on combat, bring in some other aspects of the game. You'll be surprised. I know a lot of people, because D&D is very much a combat focused game. Whether you like it or not, they can say there are 3 pillars, but good lord, most of the stuff in the characters is combat, right? But if you're open to playing it more broadly, you might find it's quite fun. I know that a lot of the challenges that you deal with at high level can be dealt with quite quickly, which means that story progression can be really quick. There were occasions where I had players who would be given a goal, and this goal would give them so many experience points or give them an entire milestone. And if they were smart about it and had the right tools at their disposal, they were able to achieve these things in like 5 or 10 minutes. So I know a lot of people think, well, at high level play, right, it's going to take longer and longer and longer to get to the next level. But it doesn't necessarily work that way, particularly if it's retooled in a way where it's not focused on combat. If all you got to do is drudgery and grind through monsters, then it'll take longer. But if you're dealing with a really broad game, then it's possible to level up, and this happened in my game on occasions when I was running the Tyranny of Dragons at a higher level. Essentially, almost every chapter was another level, and some of these chapters we could play in one session, and that one session for me was like 2.5 hours. So in 2.5 hours they would go from level 11, and the next, at the end of that session, they were level 12, because it's not scaled in terms of combat, and it's scaled in terms of negotiation. A lot of it was negotiation and a social interaction and figuring out what the goal was, and providing incentives to achieve that goal. They were able to actually level up very, very quickly rather than slowly. Okay, I think that's it. I don't think we've got anything else we need to discuss. I think we've covered this till it's dead in the water. Hopefully it's been useful to somebody. And hopefully it now provides people with a topic that is probably not discussed as much as it could be. So wherever you are in the world, whether it be the morning, the afternoon, the night, the early morning possibly, look after your family and your friends and yourself. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.